Welcome to the GSMC Car Podcast, the show that takes you on a journey to the automotive world. We talk about the latest news, from new makes and models to new technology to all of the must-have options available. Whether you're a fan of the old classics, love the latest models and technology, or have never met a vehicle you didn't want to work on, the GSMC Car Podcast has something for every car enthusiast.
Welcome to the GSMC Car Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I'm your host, David Lucy Mabel. All right, folks, keeping with our theme that we've been going on with recently, we are going to be talking about the most influential car of the 1910s. Now, if you remember correctly, if you've listened to the previous podcasts, you would have known that we are doing a series on the most influential cars from each decade to commemorate our launch on Instagram. So this one is going to be the most influential car of the 1910s. We had done the most influential car of the 1900s, the most influential car of the 1890s, and the most influential cars of the 1880s. So now we have gotten to the 1910s decade. In this segment, we are going to, or I should tell you about which car we're going to be talking about. We are going to be talking about the Rolls Royce Silver Ghost. Now, if you remember a long time ago, way back in the month of September, there was a podcast dedicated solely to the Rolls Royce Silver Ghost. This podcast is not going to be the same one, obviously. That one was talking about the Rolls Royce Silver Ghost and the basically the war hero of World War I. You already know about all of that, so if you all would like to hear that podcast, I can include a link in the Instagram in the Instagram caption or whatever, and then you all could go back to listen to that one. That was podcast number 17. This one is podcast number 48, I believe, if I am not mistaken. So that was quite a while ago. So yes, there will be some similarities. As I introduce the car, you will hear some things that you would have heard back then. But then from segment 2, I'm going to be discussing the specifications. I'm going to go more in depth on this podcast. Segment 3, I'm going to discuss some other influential cars that existed at the time and some world history. And then segment 4, I'm going to explain to you why I chose to do this car and what are my personal thoughts on it. So let's get going. So, the Rolls Royce Silver Ghost. Now, mind you, this car was not purely produced only in the 1910s. This car was produced very much in the same time window as the Ford Model T. It was made from 1906 to 1926. And if you remember from our previous podcast, the Ford Model T was produced from 1908 to 1927. So right around the same time period, just a few years, give or take, in each direction. This was also called the Rolls-Royce 40/50 horsepower. In the early days of Rolls-Royce cars, they were named after how much horsepower they had, because obviously at this time, horsepower was something that they wanted to advertise. This is something that they wanted to show off, especially when you had a car that was making 40 or 50 horsepower. I mean, these cars were very powerful for the time. They were making 4 to 5 times as much as the average car. The average car was making around 10 horsepower. I mean, the Ford Model T was making 20 horsepower, and these cars doubled 2.5 times that. I mean, 40 horsepower is double 20, 50 is 2.5 times 20. So they were even doing double the horsepower of the Ford Model T, which was the most common car of the time period. So, Rolls-Royce, there's a reason why they named it the 40/50 horsepower. This was the official name in Rolls-Royce. The Rolls-Royce Silver Ghost, that's a name that wouldn't come until later down the line, and I'll explain that to you all in a little bit. So, these cars were known as extremely reliable cars, and as a result, they were very popular with certain people in the elite, royalty, things of that sort. So the Rolls-Royce Silver Ghost name was actually the name for a specific car that had been modified and that had been, owned by a specific person. Well, it wasn't until the Rolls-Royce Motor Company came out with the Phantom Mark I, or Phantom 1, Rolls-Royce Phantom 1, however they called it, that they started referring to these older cars all as Silver Ghosts, just to differentiate them between those cars and then the subsequent Phantom 1 that would succeed this car in the mid-1920s. So that's why these cars are called the Rolls-Royce Silver Ghost, because they were known to be very quiet. And the funny thing is, this car would set a trend for Rolls-Royce, because they would have Silver Cloud, Silver Seraph, Silver Spirit, things of that sort. So silver became a real Rolls-Royce name, a real moniker for their later cars that would end up succeeding this car in its legacy. So that one guy named this car the Silver Ghost. Then Rolls-Royce adopted the name for all their older cars, and then now the word silver in the Rolls-Royce is a line that still lives on. And there's even a trim level of the modern Rolls-Royce Ghost that, is called the Silver Ghost as well. So there you have it. But this was truly an amazing car. And I wanted to do this car because of how ahead of its time and really its legacy. And this is, I think, one of the only cars that I have doubled a podcast on. I don't typically do the same car because there's, millions of different cars out there. Why do the car podcast on the same one? But this one had to be done. This was objectively the most influential car of the 1910s, if you don't count the Ford Model T and if you count that as a car of the 1900s. So this car was powered by an inline 6-cylinder engine. Now, mind you, at this time, inline 6-cylinder engines were extremely uncommon. And frankly, inline 6-cylinder engines are not extremely common today versus V6 engines. But this car had the inline 6-cylinder engine. Now, in those days, if one was going to make an inline 6-cylinder engine, they would have done it in a different fashion than what Rolls-Royce did. When cylinders were being cast, cylinders were cast in 3 groups of 2. And they were not cast with their heads as one unit. They were cast with heads as a separate unit, and then they were joined together with head bolts, and then there was a gasket in between the two of them. Rolls-Royce decided to do something very radical. They decided to cast their cylinders in 2 groups of 3 with the heads already integrated into the cylinders, and then this eliminated the need for head bolts, for a head gasket, so one less part on the car that would fail. Because if any of you all out there have North Star engines, you would know that if this was a modern technology that Cadillac had used in those cars, you would know that that would make the North Star absolutely bulletproof. Because their main problem that everybody complains about, and that actually does happen, is head gaskets and sometimes even head bolts being stripped because they were just not strong enough to keep the head attached to the cylinder block. So this is what Rolls-Royce did to combat that problem. Oh my goodness, 80 years before the North Star engine even came out. So, if only this sort of technology had caught on. But, there's something in the car world called planned obsolescence. They make a car, they design it so it can last or only be relevant for a few years, and then they come out with something better in order to force the buyer to come back and buy the new car so the company keeps on making money. In these days, that's not what Rolls-Royce was concerned with. Rolls-Royce was a real, genuine, proper car maker that made cars to last. And the funny thing is, many of these Rolls-Royce Silver Ghosts are running today. They made about 7,800 of them, give or take. I could be wrong about that, so don't quote me on that. But they made around 7,400 to 7,800 Rolls-Royce Silver Ghosts. Several of them are still running today. And these cars, the oldest of which are 115 years old, and the newest are 95 years old. That is absolutely insane. You buy a Mitsubishi Mirage from 5 years ago, that thing may or may not be running still. This is when cars were art forms. This is where cars were a source of pride for the company, not just a source of money. They were a source of pride. And this car is really what put Rolls-Royce on the map. And not only that, this car was essentially the most famous luxury car of all time given up to this point. And not only that, this set a trend for future luxury automobile makers on basically how to build their cars. These cars were not fragile. These cars were not dainty. These cars were not high maintenance like modern Rolls Royces are. Modern Rolls Royces are maybe huge, but those things are very fragile. You don't want to miss a service on something like that. You don't want to drive something like that hard lest it break. This is not the same animal as the modern Rolls Royces that are being produced by BMW. This is a completely different animal. These cars were used in wartime. If you remember my podcast number 17, I talked about Lawrence of Arabia and his adventure with his Rolls Royce, how he spoke of his Rolls Royce motor car. In fact, let me find the quote here in my notes. I was not planning on including this, but I have to say, he said, when asked by a journalist what thing he would most value, he said, I should like my own Rolls-Royce car with enough tires and petrol, which is gas, to last me all of my life. That was Lawrence of Arabia who said that. Because he just knew how much these cars had value, and he knew how good they were. If you get in a war general speaking about this, like this about a car, this car is definitely influential. These cars were overbuilt. And that set a trend for so many of the other luxury cars of this time period. Bentley would follow suit with things like the Bentley 8-liter, also an overbuilt, extremely reliable car. Cadillac would follow through with certain cars that were very overbuilt and very reliable. These were times where you did not just make cars to make a quick buck. You made cars, if you were a luxury automobile maker, that is. You made cars to last. You made cars to establish your brand image, and you made cars to establish brand loyalty. Nowadays, brands are complaining about brand loyalty. We need to get more people to buy our cars. Start making them reliable. Everybody's concerned with costs. Everybody's trying to cut costs. Everybody's doing this. Everybody's doing that. You know what? If you spent a tiny bit more money into making your cars more reliable, then I guarantee you would make more money because people would keep on coming back and buying cars to you. What I notice is that nowadays, people, they buy a car. If it's an unreliable lemon, obviously they're not going to go back to the same auto manufacturer. They're going to go to a new one. Of course, someone can say, you just have to make it just reliable enough that when it dies, they understand why it dies, so they come back to you. I was like, honestly, goodness, that could be 20 years. That could be 20 years. You want them to be reliable enough so this person buys this car. Then when their son or daughter turns 16, they get their driver's license. Then they buy them a car. And then when their other son or daughter turns 16, they buy them a car. So you can keep on getting them back generationally. That's how you do it. Well, that's what Rolls-Royce was trying to do at this time. And let me tell you, Rolls-Royce succeeded. It was known as the best car in the world. And by this time, give or take 1910s, there are about 500,000 cars. So, like, when you're considering that in a world in which 500,000 cars exist, and they are hailing a Rolls Royce as the best car in the world, that is something to be noted. Because we all know nowadays, Rolls Royce might make the most luxurious car in the world, but Rolls Royce is sure as heck not the best car in the world. The best car in the world, I don't know what car that title would go to, because so many cars are lemons these days. It's not even, honestly, it's hard to even find a good one. Even Toyota's making bad cars. I mean, my friend Alana, you've heard me mention her before. Her car, within a few months of getting it, wouldn't start. It's a brand new car, brand new 2019 Toyota Corolla or 2020, whatever the year is. Wouldn't start. Electrical system is giving problems. Apple iPhone Play or whatever doesn't work. Then the other day, her battery randomly died with no warning, and she had to get it towed to the dealer so they can give her a new battery. And here am I'm driving a 2004 Buick Park Avenue, goodness. My car has never left me stranded. It left me stranded once because of a dead battery, but other than that, it never left me stranded. My car is about to have 150,000 miles on it. There ain't no warning lights on the dashboard. Nothing's coming up. Everything's fine. Only thing I need to work on is my rear suspension. The car should be fine. Of course, I need new tires, but that's just a wear item. So, cars these days, you can't even call a car the best car in the world. Because even as good as my car is, it has its flaws. The transmission shifts roughly, either because of broken engine mounts or because the transmission just shifts roughly. And the coolant elbows were a problem on these cars because, traveling coolant passages were made of plastic. And then after, 14, 15, 16 years being on the car, they turn brittle and then they tend to crack. And then they spew coolant all over the place, causing your engine to overheat. I mean, this is all sorts of foolishness that happens with my car. So even that is not the best car in the world. But for you to have a car that was objectively the best car in the world, because horseless carriages in the time this car came out were so unreliable. These cars, you couldn't count on them to do anything. If the car ran and went anywhere, you consider yourself lucky for that day, and you didn't even know if it was going to start and run the next day. These were quote-unquote turnkey cars. These cars didn't have keys. This was the time before car keys. But these were quote-unquote turnkey cars. You hop in, you start it, and then you go, and you go, and you go forever and ever and ever. I mean, these cars were known to go on 15,000-mile road trips for testing. For endurance races, 15,000-mile round trips, and never skip a beat. That was a good car. That was a good car. So a total of 7,874 Rolls Royce Silver Ghosts were made. So I wasn't too far off when I said 7,800. And including 1,701 of those were built in the United States as a Springfield, Massachusetts factory. The specific Silver Ghost was a custom model commissioned by Claude Johnson, commercial and managing director of Rolls-Royce, to be used as a promo car, almost like a concept car, to show off the reliability and quietness of the car. Vladimir Lenin even owned one with snow tracks fitted to it. So there you have it. That was the introduction to the Rolls-Royce Silver Ghost. We're going to take a break, and in segment 2, you can hear about the specific specifications. You see what I did there? Specific specifications of the Rolls-Royce. So please stay tuned.
Are you a business owner? Someone interested in the latest news that might affect your business? Then check out the GSMC Business News Podcast, a show dedicated to keeping you up to date on all things concerning business, technology, and the stock market. Get a head start on the day as we keep you updated on the latest goings-on Wall Street, money, jobs, and technology. The GSMC Business News Podcast has you covered.
All right, folks. So in segment 2, we are going to be discussing the specifications of the Rolls Royce Silver Ghost. As you already know, in segment 1, we had introduced the car, and there were some fun facts, and basically explained why this car was influential and some of the things that it set the tone for cars to come. So, segment 2. This car had an I6 engine, as you know, and this car's engine displacement was about 7,000 cubic centimeters, which translates into about 7 liters. So it was about a 7-liter engine. It had 40 to 50 horsepower, depending on the model year and depending on not the trim level, the engine options you had. So it could make 40 or 50 horsepower, and I think even later applications made up to around 80 horsepower. So these cars were very powerful for the time period. They had a 3-speed manual transmission from 1909 to 1913. And then a 4-speed manual transmission from 1913 onward. Now, mind you, let's take a deeper look into this. European cars of the time period, we're still having, low number of gears and whatnot. And then American cars were still using 3-speed manual transmission options up until the 1970s, really. That was the most common sort of, manual transmission on an American car was a 3-speed manual. 3 on the tree, 3 on the floor, whatever, but it's 3-speed manual. This car had a 4-speed manual way back in 1913. There are some cars you could buy in recent memory that don't have 4-speed manual transmissions. So that is something that is very, very interesting and really ahead of its time. And this is purely conjecture, but I could say perhaps this is what set the tone for European cars to have 4-speed manual transmissions way before Americans even thought of such an idea. Or at least, maybe not thought of such an idea, but before they were willing to implement an idea like that, having 4-speed manual transmissions instead of 3-speed manual transmissions. You see, with a 4-speed manual transmission, you have more gears, so the higher you go in the gears, the more efficiently the engine is running off of the RPM. So when you get to a certain RPM, you have to shift gears because your engine's going to want to make more use of its power. And then you get to a point where, you're at like optimum RPM or whatever, and then you shift gears. If you stay in the 3-speed and you stay in 3rd gear, then you get to a point where your engine is running inefficiently. It's running, but 3rd gear is the last gear, so it's really long, and it's like a final drive sort of thing. And it's burning a bunch of fuel because it's not running as efficiently as it should be. If you get one more gear in there, then you're running more efficiently and using less fuel as a result. Well, this is one of the reasons why some of those automatic transmissions in American cars, especially into the malaise era of the 70s, oh my goodness. The 70s, some of these cars were getting shamelessly 8 miles per gallon. You take like a Buick Electra 225 from the 70s. I think this had a 2-speed, automatic transmission because it wasn't a manual. I think those cars were getting like 8 miles per gallon because it only had 2 or 3 speeds in the transmission. They didn't put enough speeds to make good use of the power and to make it run more efficiently. This car, the Rolls Royce Silver Ghost I speak of now, this car was known for getting very good fuel mileage. And I'm not talking about very good fuel mileage for the time, like, 12 miles per gallon. No, I'm talking about 18, 19, 20 miles per gallon. Stuff that can keep up with a modern automobile. Let me move on and explain you more about this car. These cars were all coach built. This is an art that has all but died in the car world. These cars were coach built. So you could buy, when you bought the car, you bought the chassis. You bought the frame, you bought the engine, you bought the wheels, you bought the mechanical components. And then, after you bought the chassis, you would commission a body from a coach builder and then they would attach the body to the chassis for you, which is some of the reasons why these cars were so dang expensive, because that's not something a regular person could do. Think of it, at the Ford Model T at that time period, these cars were mass-produced. All of them pretty much looked the same, depending on the body style that they came in, of course. And then you went to the Ford dealership, you bought a Model T, and then you were happy-go-lucky, you were driving along the next day. This car, not so. You had to buy the chassis, then you had to get a custom body made from a coach builder to attach to the chassis. So therefore, as a result, along with things like the Bentley 8-liter, which, granted, the Bentley 8-liter didn't come until like the 1930s. This was not a car of this time period, but this is something that many people might be a bit more familiar with. The Bentley 8-liter, this Rolls Royce Silver Ghost, and heck, I even want to say even some Cadillacs of, this time period, the teens to the 20s to the 30s, these cars, none of them looked the same. They were all unique because even though they all had the same chassis, same engine, same mechanical components, each person that bought the car had a different style of body commissioned for it. And this is where we get some of our car terms today. You get things like landaulet. Landaulet is a car that has a fixed roof over the driver, but then the back portion of the roof over the passengers drops down in like a semi-convertible. This is where you get things like town car. Town car was a specific body style. There were Phaetons. Phaetons were a specific body style. Then you had full landauds. Landauds were a different body style than a landaulet. I mean, this is where you get a lot of your different, car style names. I mean, we could all name a car that had Phaeton, Volkswagen Phaeton. That name branches from this time period in which you could have a Phaeton body built onto your chassis. The Mercedes-Benz S63 Pullman landaulet, which is like some really rare one-off car made for like presidents and whatnot. Landaulet, that was a true landaulet, by the way, but that comes from this time period. Town car, Lincoln Town Car. It wasn't a town car, it was just a regular old sedan, but it came from this time period. All of these, these coach builders had different names for the different bodies that they would put on them. And of course, you had roadsters, you had dual cowl Phaetons, you had so many different sorts of car body styles. So these cars were all coach built. So as a result, no two Silver Ghosts are ever the same. And then it was common at the time period that handbrakes stopped only the rear wheels and the pedal was a transmission brake. You remember hearing about this in the Ford Model T podcast. Ford Model T had it was very common at the time, as, the Rolls Royce had very much the same setup, but very, very foreign to us as modern people who drive modern cars. These cars did not have disc brakes, they did not have drum brakes. They had a hand lever that attached directly to the rear wheels that stopped the rear wheels under emergency situations or under parking situations, stopped the car from rolling. And then you had your pedal, but your pedal, it was like it activated a drum that would clamp the drive shaft in the transmission because all these cars were rear-wheel drive. Americans had not made front-wheel drive at the time. And then the Europeans, only the French, I believe, were making front-wheel drive during this time period, the 1910s. And so these cars would clamp the drive shaft and stop the car from rolling by literally cutting the power to the wheels instead of stopping the wheels individually. It would stop the power coming from the transmission that went to the wheels. That's how those cars would brake. But, mind you, this must have been a very reliable system because I'm going to tell you, these cars, many of them are still running today, as well as Ford Model Ts. Many Ford Model Ts are still running today. And so I guess it must have worked. Of course, I would be horribly terrified if my car only had a handbrake for the rear and then my brake clamped around my transmission to stop my wheels from turning instead of actually stopping my wheels with like physical contact or something. I am not about that because the way I drive, goodness, I need good brakes. If I do not have good brakes, I'm going to be splat across someone's windshield. I mean, like, it's not going to be good. But anyway, moving on. So these cars, like I had said in the especially overbuilt. They were extremely reliable. Can't stress that enough. The car also included a working electrical system and full pressure lubrication systems. So get this. This car had, some of the gauges were electrical. In a time where gauges were run purely off of mechanics, this car had electrical systems in it. And this car had a system in which every few hundred miles or so, the car would automatically lubricate the lubrication points. It had a full pressure lubrication system that it would do under pressure and lubricate the points on the chassis that needed to be lubricated. That is amazing. That is absolutely amazing. And you can see in later cars that came from the time period and that came from the subsequent decades to follow, these things were commonplace on those cars. For example, I'm going to say the Bentley 8-liter again. Bentley 8-liter has an automatic full pressure oil, dispenser thing, the oil pressure lubrication thing, because it undoubtedly got this idea from the Rolls Royce, because Bentley and Rolls Royce at the time were beginning to merge and became the same company after a while. These are things that the Rolls Royce Silver Ghost set into motion that, would forever change the car world. And like I said, cylinders in the heads were one unit. There was no need for a head gasket. And this is what I was talking about, the gas mileage. During the London to Edinburgh and then back to London race, this was in 1911, the car reportedly got an average of 19 miles per gallon. This is better miles per gallon than my car. I drive a relatively modern automobile, and I average around 17 to 20 miles per gallon, depending on how I'm driving. Lately, I've been averaging around 19, so about the same as this Rolls Royce. But I'm not always like that. This car was averaging 19 miles per gallon in those days, and this car was considerably heavier than my car. These cars weighed several thousand pounds. My car weighs about 3,800 pounds. These cars were considerably heavier than my car. Because, mind you, in those days, there were no plastic foolishness. You're building a car with real steel, with real chrome, with good hardwood, with all sorts of, good, durable, long-lasting materials. You're not putting plastic bumpers on a Rolls Royce Silver Ghost. Those things didn't exist at the time, which thankfully they didn't. And that was basically the Rolls Royce Silver Ghost. Those are the specifications. Those are things that one would want to know about the Rolls Royce Silver Ghost. So moving on. In segment 3, after the break, we are going to be discussing some other cars and some history that took place during this time period. So please stay tuned.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching.
Hey!
The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be, visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Okay, welcome back, folks. So in segment 1, We discussed the introduction to the Rolls Royce Silver Ghost, why on, Earth is it so influential, and you soon found out why. And then in segment 2, we discussed the specifications and some of the mechanical things that really made this car special. So in segment 3, we are going to be discussing some other cars that existed during this time period, as well as some historical things that were going on. So in this time period, in the 1910s, you had things like the Cadillac touring car, the 1912 Cadillac touring car. Now, you've heard me mention this car before, and you've heard me mention the fact several times that Cadillac was the first car to offer a electric starter as standard equipment. So this car was the 1912 Cadillac touring car. So 109 years ago, Cadillac invented the electric starter and started putting it in all of their cars. So if you can turn your car key today and start your car, and you don't have to manually crank your V6 or your V8, thank Cadillac. Because the story behind this was that there was a man who was starting his car. Now, mind you, goodness, in those days, a car was liable to backfire on you if you were hand cranking it. Now, when the car backfired, the handle that you used to crank the engine would go flying in the opposite direction. And that's why there was a special way for you to hold this so you wouldn't break any fingers and you wouldn't break your arm. But this poor unsuspecting man had his head near the handle, and the head, the head hit him with such force that it ended up killing him. Well, when Henry M. Leland, who was the president of Cadillac at the time, had heard about this, he said, I will not have my cars killing people. So he had commissioned for them to design a way for the car to not need to be crank started. And thus, they came with an electric starter, thus inventing the electric ignition instead of the manual things that people had to do back then. So, inventing the electric ignition, Cadillac went on to put this as standard equipment in their 1912 touring car, and then in subsequent, every single car made after that had an electric ignition. Eventually, all companies would switch over to it using Cadillac's technology. So if today you can have an electric starter on your car, thank Cadillac. And then there was the Bugatti Type 13, which was Bugatti's first true car. The Bugatti had been making cars as partnerships with other companies, but the Bugatti Type 13, which was their first true car that was made solely by Bugatti, using Bugatti, building methods and all sorts of foolishness. That was the 1913, it was the Bugatti Type 13. I don't know what year it came out. I think it was 1913, honestly. One thing I will say, during doing research for some other cars during this time period, a lot of these cars that existed during these time periods didn't go on to be particularly influential. By this time, cars and their companies that made them were largely experimental. There were several car companies that existed at the time, but nothing that was so influential that was worth mentioning. There were some cars that would go on to start companies. For example, Maxwell, went defunct in 1925. Walter P. Chrysler took it over and then made Chrysler in 1927 from the remnants of the Maxwell Motor Company. There was Franklin. Franklin was, I believe, a GM mark for the longest while. There was Oakland. Oakland was a GM mark that was under Pontiac in their GM lineup. So there was some cars going on there, but none of them really survived long enough to be considered super influential. And so that's why I didn't bother mentioning them even in this segment 3. So let's go on and talk about some historical things. During this time period, it was June 28th, 1914, Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austro-Hungary was murdered, and his death triggered the events that led to World War I. So, mind you, it could be also a reason why there wasn't so many influential cars during this time period, because get this, it's World War II. World War I. Many cars and their companies were being commissioned to be sold into battle, sold for the war effort, or their factories were retooled to create weapons for the war effort. So at this point, it's not that big of a deal to constantly be making more and more automobiles, because during wartime, people are not focusing on buying cars. People are not focusing on, having the most opulent luxury vehicles. People are focusing on the war effort. Men were off fighting the war. Women stayed back to work in the factories to manufacture goods for the war effort, be it planes, be it, tanks, automobiles, armored cars, whatever you may have that would be needed in the war effort. These cars were being made for that, or their factories that were making the cars were being made to produce cars or to produce other things for the war effort. So there could be a reason why there was not a huge boom of cars by this time period. But I will tell you this. You've heard me give sort of updates on the status of the horse and buggy as a viable means of transportation over the years since the car was invented by Carl Benz in 1886. In the 1880s, the car was so expensive, the horse and buggy was still the most efficient way and the cheapest way to get around, considering the first cars were very expensive, very difficult to produce, took a long time, and not only that, they weren't very reliable to begin with anyway. In the 1890s would spell the beginning of the end for the horse and buggy. The 1900s would be the last nail in the coffin of the horse and buggy. And by this time, the 1910s, horse and buggy had all but been phased out in most areas of, developed countries, like the United States. I mean, by this time, there's about 500,000 cars on the road across the world, and I could say with great confidence, probably a majority of them were in the United States, because we would have had the most use for them. So you getting all of this. You're getting all of this goodness. I mean, it only makes sense. It only makes sense that the horse and buggy would no longer be a thing. So, moving on. In April 15th, 1912, the Titanic sinks on its maiden voyage in the northern Atlantic Ocean. I feel like I should mention why exactly it was said that the Titanic had sunk, even though this is not a boat or a ship podcast. It's a mechanical thing nonetheless, so I thought I should mention it. Well, the captain of the Titanic, God rest his soul, I can't remember his name. I think it was Captain John Smith or something. I don't know, something real generic. But the captain was trying to beat a speed record. And during this time period, the communications between ships wasn't the best. There were radio signals, but sometimes they would get muffled. Well, there was a radio signal that history would soon find that was ignored by the Titanic for them to be careful because there were icebergs in the northern Atlantic. Well, get this. Trying to beat the speed record, the Titanic was going full speed ahead and was not being very careful. So by the time they saw this iceberg, it was too late. Even though they had not hit it yet, it had become unavoidable. And you could see it in the movie, and you could imagine it in real life, what the deck was scrambling, or not the deck, the crew was scrambling on board to do. Cut power to the engines, turn this massive ship in a different direction within a few hundred yards of this iceberg. There was no way it was going to happen. If they had not been going so fast and they actually heeded the message about the icebergs in the water, the Titanic, and subsequently 1,700 or something people that died that day as a result of the Titanic sinking, the greatest maritime disaster in all of history. If they had just been going slower and heeded the message, they would have been able to see the iceberg in time. They would have been able to avoid it. the Titanic and all of her crew and passengers would have made it to New York, and then the Titanic would have lived to see another day. However, that's not what happened. They were going too fast. It's like you're driving a car. You're speeding. You see an obstacle in the road, but then you don't have a chance to avoid it, and then you end up crashing into it. And this ripped a giant hole in the hull of the Titanic. Watertight compartments were overwhelmed before they could even be closed. And of course, in those days, lifeboats were relative to the size of the ship, not how many people the ship could hold. So there weren't enough lifeboats. In a panic, so many lifeboats left half empty, and people froze to death in the cold, frigid Atlantic northern waters. That's what happened. That's how the fate of the Titanic happened. Of course, not a Titanic podcast. It's a car podcast. So let's get back to car stuff. Or let's get back to history stuff, because it's the history section. The Russian Revolution would happen in 1917. This is the Bolshevik, not Bolshek, Bolshevik Revolution. Don't demonetize me. You're not monetizing me, but don't stop listening. That was a slip of the tongue. The Bolshevik Revolution would happen, and then the Bolshevik Revolution would then be the basically the, I don't know, it was the beginnings of communist Russia. It had not been the USSR just yet, but it was the beginnings of communist Russia, because at this time, the Romanov family, which was the last, royal family of Europe, which were actually cousins with the British royal family. You should have seen Tsar Nicholas II and King George V. They looked like twins. They were like first cousins. They were like double first cousins or something. They looked like twins. But Tsar Nicholas II and his family are all beheaded. And then they take over the Russian government and then turn it into a communist state. So this is the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917. And then there was Prohibition that began in the United States January 19th, 1919, that would last until 1933. So through all the 20s, Prohibition was a thing. And Prohibition would have an effect on car culture, believe it or not. You'll soon find out why in the upcoming podcasts. And then there was the Republic of China, which was established on January 1st, 1912. So these were things that were going on in the 1912s, in the 1910s, I should say. And so this was basically history of this time period. So moving on, we're going to be discussing my thoughts in segment 4, but you're going to have to wait after the break.
Do you work in the world of marketing and advertising? Are you a media buyer or the owner of an agency? Have you been looking for a podcast to help stay on top of all the goings-on of those worlds? The GSMC Marketing News Podcast is dedicated to keeping you up to date on all things concerning marketing and advertising. Get the latest marketing news, from what major businesses have planned for the coming year to the newest trends in advertising, from podcasts, digital and streaming, to the old standbys of radio, television, and billboards. The GSMC Marketing News Podcast has you covered, whether you're a marketing agent or a business trying to expand your brand.
Okay, welcome back, folks. Hope you enjoyed that small break. So in segment 3, we discussed some of different cars that existed during the time period, and we discussed some different historical events that were going on that would eventually shape, the world as we know it today, that were going on in the 1910s, which was about 110 years ago. So moving on, we're going to be discussing my thoughts. Now, in this segment, I'm going to want to justify why I chose to decide to this, why I chose to record another podcast on the Rolls Royce Silver Ghost versus the Cadillac touring car, which, as you know, was the first car with an electric starter. Would you say, wasn't that more influential? And I would say not necessarily. I mean, here's what you have here. You've got a car that was very much revolutionary for its time period in terms of everything. Build quality, reliability, technology, speed, power, versatility, so many different things. And then you get a car that is known for one piece of technology. Even though this piece of technology would end up outliving everything that the Rolls Royce ever did. Because nothing on the Rolls Royce still exists today. Electric starters still exist today. However, on the Rolls Royce, the principle of that car still exists today. Several principles of what was put into that car, even though they may not exist in the same form that they did back then. Several principles, the influence of that car still reigns supreme today in several circles. The Cadillac touring car is largely forgotten. The only thing that was so great about it was the fact that it had an electric starter. But that was not enough in my book to consider it the most influential car of the 1910s. And some may ask, well, why didn't you just, cut down the number of podcasts and then just do the Ford Model T as the most influential car for the 1900s, the 1910s, and the 1920s, because that's how long it was produced. And part of me was feeling lazy and wanted to do that, but at the same time, I felt like it wasn't fair to you all, because I wanted to do this podcast so I can teach people about cars, be it about specific models, be it about the car news that's the most recent that's going on in the world, or be it about other things related to cars. I wanted to teach people about cars. The Ford Model T, being the legend that it was, being the great car that it was, wasn't the only car that was produced during the 1900s to the 1920s. There were several other cars, and it would not be genuine of me for me to skip over an entire 2 decades worth of car history just because I was feeling lazy. I had to do this car again because, like I said, this decade is World War I. There's not that many influential cars going around. There's not that many cars that would survive, really, because a lot of cars, anything ingenious, would have been waited until after the war when the world wasn't consumed with that foolishness. The next time you're going to see a boom in car production and advances in car technology wouldn't be for another 10 years until the 1920s, which we all know is the roaring 20s. And then you will find again in the 1930s, there's a lull in car production because, it's the Great Depression. You'll find once again in the 1940s, another lull. I mean, this time World War II was the one that's taking all of it. So, from the 1910s, World War I, it's not that surprising to know that even though there were several cars being built, not many of them were particularly ingenious or particularly special enough to merit an entire podcast on their influence, which is why I chose the Rolls Royce Silver Ghost all over again. Now, mind you, this podcast is a different angle from that one. The podcast on the Rolls Royce Silver Ghost, the first one, podcast number 17, that is a podcast based on the war history of the Rolls Royce Silver Ghost, how it was the hero of World War I, how, it helped enemies escape from it helped soldiers escape from enemies in, the Arabian desert. Lawrence of Arabia shot a board in 2 pieces and strapped it onto the leaf springs that had been broken, and then the car ran fine for like 2-3 weeks afterward. I mean, these are things. These are things that I discussed in the previous podcast on the Rolls Royce Silver Ghost way back in September. This is a different angle. This is talking about the legacy of the car and how it's lived on since then. So I think that was super important to make that distinction. They were, once again, overbuilt, reliable, Still running today, many of them. One of the first successful i6 engines. Now, mind you, the i6 was like the V8 of Europe. I mean, the most powerful cars for the longest while got inline six-cylinder engines. They were inherently balanced, inherently smooth, inherently reliable, because there weren't counter forces acting against each other with an odd number of cylinders, firing in different directions. They were all firing in one line. And simple to produce, because you don't have to produce, an engine that has two cylinder heads. If you have an inline cylinder setup, you have all of your cylinder heads in one line. And then it was the first civilian car to be used in combat. Granted, it wasn't the civilian version that was used in combat. It was a combat-ready version, but so many of these combat-ready versions were just converted back to civilian versions after the war. So it was basically the same car underneath all of that thick metal plating, armor, and whatnot that they used in the battlefield. And it was one of the most desirable antique cars in history. And not just was, still is one of the most desirable antique cars in history. Just to give you all a perspective, you can buy a Ford Model T today for about $20,000. Ford Model T is cheaper than a lot of the new cars you could buy today, because there's just that many of them. Even though it's been almost 100 years since they stopped producing them, there's just that many of them. There will always be availability of Ford Model Ts. The Rolls Royce Silver Ghosts, however, I looked up on ClassicCars.com. I saw 5 Rolls Royce Silver Ghosts, and 2 of them were modern Rolls Royce Silver Ghosts. So 3 Rolls Royce Silver Ghosts, and the most expensive of which was like $360,000 or something ridiculous like that. Granted, it's not ridiculous considering how much these cars are worth and how desirable they are. But just to put that into perspective, this car was influential then. It continued to be influential, and it remains influential today and will likely remain influential in the future, because this car was just so ahead of its time. People couldn't fathom what sort of influence and legacy this car would leave behind after it was no longer produced. Rolls-Royce cars of today are shells of their former selves when it comes to build quality and reliability. They have really nice materials, but reliability is absolutely not a thing on these cars. Rolls-Royce has lost their way. Granted, it also has to do with the change in luxury and what luxury means. Luxury for the longest time, and then you will find this in my podcast on the life and the death of the American luxury sedan. Granted, this is not American luxury sedan, but some of the principles remain true. Luxury for a time period meant that cars were well built, and that cars were reliable and built with the finest materials, with the finest craftsmanship. That's what luxury meant at the time. And then nowadays, there is a shift in what luxury means. Nowadays, for a car that is a luxury car to be successful, it has to do a bit of everything. It has to be well built, as in pieces not falling off. It has to be built with very good materials. It has to be sporty. It has to be fast. It has to be this. It has to be that. When you try to cram so many different disciplines inside of one car, it is a reason why so many luxury cars are not reliable today. Let's take Mercedes-Benz S63 Amg. Okay, this is the top-of-the-line S-Class, like twin-turbo V8. We're talking about upwards of 600 horsepower. I mean, these cars are, this is a car. Like, this is a proper car. It's also a luxury car. It's a sports sedan. It's everything. These cars are known for problems. Why? Too many electrical issues. The cars are horribly over-engineered. Not overbuilt, but over-engineered. They're over-engineered and underbuilt. Meaning that there's so much engineering going into car, and then the hardware to actually back up this engineering is not as good as it ought to be. And then not only that, there was a string of problems with their head bolts. that would effectively total the entire car. I once saw a bill to get the head bolts replaced on an S63 Amg car. It was like $55,000 the dealer wanted to replace the engine. That's ridiculous. There was a time in history that would not fly. It was supposed to be your Econobox, your cheap car that you would buy that would be unreliable because you got what you paid for. You bought a cheap car, you got something unreliable, or in which reliability was a mixed bag. You bought an expensive car, you got something that was super reliable that was supposed to last you for the next 100 years. Which many of these Rolls Royce Silver Ghosts did last 100 years and are still running today in unrestored condition. That's not something a Rolls Royce Phantom from 20, 30 years ago can still do. Or at least whatever the top of the line Rolls Royce was 30 years ago. Maybe Rolls Royce Silver Cloud or something, I don't know. That's insane. Just take a moment to mull on that. There was a time in which that was absolutely unacceptable. The people who were shelling out hundreds of thousands of dollars in today's money for a car did not want it to be sporty. They did not want it to be, fast. They did not want it to be all of these things that people feel like cars have to be. They did not want it to have all the latest, technology and whatnot. They wanted it to be well-engineered, not over-engineered, well-engineered, well-built and overbuilt, and reliable. And that's what they got. So if you bought a Rolls Royce Silver Ghost way back in the early days of the 20th century, if you bought one back then, you made an investment for several generations to come. You buy a Rolls Royce today, in 10, 15 years, that car will not run as well as the day that you bought it. Because they're just not as reliable anymore. This is what made the Rolls Royce Silver Ghost such a legacy, such a legend. These cars did not die. They did not die. These were probably the most reliable cars ever made up until that point, and probably up until the Mercedes 300D of the 1980s. So if I were to put all of them together, the best cars, most reliable cars ever made, Rolls Royce Silver Ghost is definitely on that list. So there you have it. That's why I chose the Rolls Royce Silver Ghost to do this podcast on. Even though I already did another one, I had to do it again because there was simply no other car of the 1910s that could hold a candle to the Rolls Royce Silver Ghost. This was truly, truly a legendary, influential, and amazing automobile that was known the world over and that will continue to be known the world over. Even after it's been not produced for nearly 100 years. So, thank you for listening to the GSMC Car Podcast. Please follow us on Instagram and on Twitter. And you can find our podcast on YouTube, Spreaker, and Apple Podcast, as well as Spotify. And please leave us a like, a comment, share us with your friends, share us with your car community so that they can learn a bit more about cars and what makes them tick and several of the things that we discussed here on this podcast. So thank you so much for listening and have a good night.
You've been listening to the GSMC Car Podcast, part of the GSMC Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcasts on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type GSMC into your favorite podcast app to find all of the shows from the GSMC Podcast Network. From movies to music, from sports to entertainment, from business news to weird news. Please subscribe to the podcast and follow us on Twitter and Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you've enjoyed today's episode.